So I'm just gonna steal this idea from Trey the Explainer and Cody and go ahead and hop onto that iceberg meme trend. The question is, what kind of iceberg would I do for this channel? There are multiple history icebergs I've seen, some involving event names, some involving random dates, but I thought I'd mix in a little bit of geography and go with this one made by Reddit user No Free Gasoline involving countries. There have been many countries lost to history, some of which are so obscure or temporary or even just conceptual that they are truly deep down in the iceberg of historical knowledge. Looking at this iceberg, there is a lot to cover in the deeper layers, even with the first few layers being easy. When I attempted to record this the first time, the runtime was 40 minutes long, so I decided it's best to do this in two parts. We'll cover about the first 3.5 layers in this part, and then the rest of the iceberg will be finished next week. We gotta be thorough here. So let's get started with Layer 1. So yeah, this layer is not even technically on the iceberg, and it makes sense because these are countries everyone knows about. Probably because there's a good chance you live in one of these. We have the United States of America, Japan, Brazil, France, Netherlands, Britain, or more properly known as the United Kingdom, Germany, Congo, and China. Now granted, the Congo could technically apply to two nations. I'm going to assume this user meant the Democratic Republic of the Congo because that's usually the more famous one. Either way, pretty straightforward. Moving on to Layer 2. These are the countries that you probably know if you've owned a world map or an atlas at some point in your life. But it is understandable if an average person is not familiar with these. We've got the tiny European nations of Monaco, Liechtenstein, and San Marino, and then we've also got the tiny Pacific island nations of Tuvalu and Nauru. Then of course we have the tiny Himalayan nation of Bhutan. These countries being a minimal amount of obscure make up only the surface of the iceberg. So now we gotta dive underneath the surface into the water for Layer 3, but before we do, I'm going to talk about this video's sponsor, Ridge. Ridge is already famous for its metal plate wallets, and I've been using one for years now. But Ridge is also branching out into offering other convenient products as well, and I got to try a new product of theirs, the Ridge Key Case. Ridge's key case allows you to store up to 6 keys in a single case that effectively turns it into a Swiss Army knife, but all of your keys instead. No more jangly noises, no more annoying moments where the keys poke you in your pocket, and everything is much more compact. I got one to match my wallet, and I didn't realize how much of a difference this would make, but I'm definitely keeping this product too. If you use the code EMPEROR with the link below, you can get 15% off your order, so get yourself a Ridge wallet or a key case or any of their other products today. Thanks again to Ridge for sponsoring this video. So now we have nations no longer around and left in the dustbin of history, but these are still entities a lot of people know about. We've got Rome, which I suppose in this case can include anything from the kingdom to the republic to the empire to the west and the east. Then we've got the Mayan civilization and the Aztecs, the two most well-known North American native states. Then there's Imperial Japan, which is basically Japan between 1868 and 1945, when it was very expansionist. The Confederates, referring to the South that seceded from the United States during the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Then there's the German Empire, which lasted from 1871 to 1918, famously the Germany from World War I. Now, let's get into the fourth layer. Part of the reason why I'm doing the first 3.5 layers in part 1 is not only that the first 3 layers are a breeze, but that the fourth layer by far has the most to talk about overall. We're not going to get through the entire fourth layer today, and there are so many interesting things here. To keep things organized though, the part of layer 4 that I will talk about in this half will be a part of 2 group categories. That way I don't repeat myself too often, especially when so many of these nations were short-lived. The 2 groups are Russian Civil War states and Axis power puppet states. So let's dig in. In 1917, the Russian Empire ended with a revolution. Within less than a year, the former empire descended into a state of civil war that would last all the way until 1922. Both sides of the Civil War would create buffer states or client states at times, and then there were also nations wanting to avoid both of them and earn independence for themselves, but ended up failing. One side was the White Russian forces, which established many republics. In many cases, these were territories of the former Russian Empire that had governors or generals take control for themselves to prevent the Bolsheviks from seizing them. Or they wanted power for themselves. It really depends. The only one that the Iceberg explicitly mentions is the Provisional Siberian Government, which in itself could refer to one of two provisional Siberian governments, both of which only lasted briefly in 1918. However, there are so many other potential forces to talk about, but to save you the trouble, they would barely last a year or two at most, and all of them would fall to the Bolshevik forces. In the case of the Bolsheviks, the Iceberg mentions the Far Eastern Republic, a state set up in Russia's southeast in 1920 by pro-Bolshevik forces after Japan abandoned their Siberian expedition into Russia. Many of the Allied powers of World War I intervened in the Russian Civil War, and they figured that if they formed a buffer state in this area, it would prevent another such invasion from Japan, and make it easier for the Bolsheviks to focus west before turning east. Once the Bolsheviks succeeded in defeating White Russian forces, they annexed the buffer state in 1922 right before forming the Soviet Union. In terms of the temporary breakaway nations during the Russian Civil War wanting to avoid Russia altogether, the Iceberg mentions two. Firstly, there is the Belarusian People's Republic. Also known as the Belarusian Democratic Republic, this was an attempt for Belarus to achieve independence from the Russian Empire in 1918. However, they had trouble controlling Belarus and competed with the Belarus Soviet Socialist Republic, as well as Polish forces also trying to take control of the area. By 1919, the government went into exile, ending the republic. They are still in exile today, making them the oldest continuous government in exile, as they do not currently support the Lukashenko regime and are now trying to rather represent the Belarusian diaspora around the world. Then the final entry for this subcategory, and debatably the most interesting, the Free Territory, also known as Makhnovia. During the confusion of the Russian Civil War, a group of libertarian socialists and anarchists teamed up to attempt a stateless society in modern-day southeastern Ukraine. They had a military ran by a man named Nestor Makhno, which was used to try and keep out both Bolshevik and White Russian forces, using a flag that was merely black and said the Russian words for "Power gives birth to parasites, long live anarchy." Outlasting many of the temporary states created during the Russian Civil War, the anarchists fought until they were ultimately defeated in August of 1921 by Bolshevik armies, with Makhno escaping to Paris. While you could argue this was technically not a state, it's still a neat group to study about. Like I previously mentioned, the Russian Civil War involved many temporary states, whether buffer, client, fully independent, or in the case of the last one, not a state at all. There could probably be an entire Iceberg meme on those nations alone. But in terms of the ones explicitly mentioned on this iceberg, we're finished and we can move on to the next group. Despite all the talk about Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan being superior nations, they sure did have a hard time actually holding the territories they conquered during World War II. To make it easier for them, and to spare resources and soldiers, they often collaborated with other local far-right groups to establish puppet states. They'd be sympathetic enough to essentially do what they say, but take up all the work on administration and policing the territory. One of the things that Germany did happens to be an entry on this iceberg, Reichskommissariats. During World War II, Nazi Germany had a policy of Lebensraum, meaning living space, which entailed setting aside lands for future German settlement. Areas occupied by Nazi Germany that were envisioned to eventually be incorporated into the Reich proper were put into administrative units called Reichskommissariats. These weren't quite fully puppet regimes, but they weren't nations either. There were ones set up in Belgium, Netherlands, and Norway, but two harsher ones that were set up were one that ruled the Baltic states called Ostland, and then one for Ukraine. For the Ukraine and Ostland Reichskommissariats, the Nazi views of the local populations being subhuman meant that they were effectively ran as colonial regimes, exploiting the area for resources at Germany's sole benefit. Obviously, these were all gone by the end of World War II. For actual puppet states, we have entries for Vichy France, which was a German puppet state set up in southern France after France surrendered in 1940. Far-right French members of the government and army ran this puppet state under Philippe Pétain at a government in, well, Vichy. Some colonies decided to support the Vichy regime, meaning this puppet state technically possessed a short-lived colonial empire. Another entry on this iceberg, the Free French, refers to the French colonies and resistance groups that actively resisted the Vichy regime and would end up helping to liberate France under Charles de Gaulle. But the Vichy regime didn't even last until then in 1944, as in 1942 the remaining territories were divided up by Italy and Germany. The next puppet state is the independent state of Croatia. This very ironically named puppet state was jointly controlled by Germany and Italy after Yugoslavia was partitioned in 1941. However, once Italy deposed Mussolini and switched sides in 1943, Germany was the sole puppeteer. This one lasted until the end, although most of it was liberated by Yugoslavian partisans. After Italy's switch, Hitler rescued Mussolini from jail and invaded Italy, setting up another entry on this list, the Italian Social Republic, which controlled northern Italy from 1943 until the war's end, although just like with Croatia, a lot of it fell to partisan forces. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire set up several puppet states of their own, especially to support their propagandic ideas of an East Asia co-prosperity sphere, disguising their imperialism with false ideas of Asian cooperation, freeing Asia from European domination, which is why they invaded China. The two Japanese puppet states mentioned on this iceberg include Azad Hind and the Empire of Vietnam. Azad Hind was a group of Indians who wanted to expel the British that the Japanese planned to use to control most of India as a puppet state should they successfully take it. However, during the war, the only territory they controlled were the Andaman and Nicobar Islands off the coast of Burma. Then the Empire of Vietnam was a puppet state set up in, well, Vietnam in the final months of the war, as Japan's resources were now too strained to just simply occupy the territory themselves. Very short-lived. As you can see, those two groups discussed a lot in Layer 4, but there are still a lot more interesting entries to go, and we'll get to them in Part 2 for next week's video. I hope you found these entries interesting, because I assure you the next part is even more interesting. Until then, I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.